In the infinite stillness of space, where darkness seems the eternal backdrop for all existence, there lies a forbidden zone, a place where humanity's gaze, though it stretches billions of light years, is forced to pause, to bow in humility. Paradoxically, this is not an abyss woven from the absence of light. It is entirely the opposite. It is a wall built from the most primal, blinding light we know, an impenetrable desert of plasma fire, a veil that obscures our vision by the sheer, absolute power of creation itself. We call it by a deceptively gentle technical name, solar conjunction. But behind that astronomical term lies a cosmic truth. It is the great blind spot in our solar system, a region hidden not by darkness, but by a light so brilliant, so overwhelming it cannot be endured. Imagine that for a moment. A blind spot that is not black, but a searing, incandescent white. This is a temporary yet unavoidable alignment in the celestial dance, a fleeting moment in the orbits of the planets. It occurs when Earth, our mother star, the Sun, and another object farther out, perhaps resilient Mars, the great Jupiter, or a lonely robotic probe, fall into near-perfect alignment. In this cosmic ballet, the Sun stands in the middle. It is not just our source of life. It becomes a colossal guardian, a wall of fire that cannot be surpassed. The very light that nurtures us now becomes the barrier to our curiosity. In this blinding glare, all communication is severed. Even our most resilient spacecraft, the robotic emissaries we send to distant worlds, must fall into a forced silence as they drift into this zone. Their signals, faint whispers carrying precious data from Mars or the asteroid belt, are instantly drowned. They are swallowed by the relentless static roar of our parent star, an eternal radio storm that obscures all else. The conjunction is not merely a visual blind spot. It is a black hole of information, an enforced pause in our dialogue with the cosmos. We know they are out there, drifting in the deep, but we cannot hear them, cannot see them. We can only wait. We can only trust in the laws of physics and hope they emerge on the other side. It is a veil that cannot be pierced, a place where our understanding must yield to patience. And it is here, within this profound silence imposed by cosmic fire, that our story tonight begins. And right at this moment, within that very veil of blinding fire, an object drifts in solitude. It is not a human-made machine, equipped with heat shields or antennae for communication. It is a far more ancient traveler, a primordial entity of ice, rock, and cosmic dust. We call it 3I divided by Atlas. Its name holds a special significance, but we will return to that. What makes 3I divided by Atlas the focus of our contemplation tonight is not just its origin, but its resilience. Its story is one of defiance. The cosmic graveyard of comets is littered with the names of those who failed this very test. Most icy visitors, upon making their fateful pilgrimage toward the sun, face a simple choice: flare up in a final, glorious display, or shatter into dust. They disintegrate, torn apart by gravity, and vaporized by the heat. But 3I divided by Atlas did the impossible. It survived. We watched, holding our breath, as it made its death-defying dive toward our star. It swept past perihelion, flying through the million-degree furnace where space itself is warped and radiation screams. And by some miracle, its structure, its nucleus, held, it endured. But, right after that moment of great victory, just as we prepared to study this survivor in detail as it began its outward journey, 3I divided by Atlas did the next thing on its determined path. It drifted straight into the forbidden zone. It disappeared completely behind the sun's plasma veil, entering the solar conjunction. It is now on the other side, in an absolute darkness, created by the most brilliant light. Its silence now carries an entirely different meaning. This is not the silence of death. We witnessed it survive. This is the silence of obscurity, an enforced silence, not of finality, but of suspense, heavy with the unknown. And in that blinding, impenetrable shadow, 3 great questions hover in the minds of every astronomer, 3 mysteries heavy with anticipation. First, what is it doing in that darkness? Isolated completely from our view, what physical transformations is it undergoing? Second, are the extreme heat and the immense gravitational forces it just endured now bending or permanently altering its orbit in ways our mathematical models cannot predict? And the strangest, boldest question, one that is almost philosophical, can a comet, after being baked to its core, torn at by cosmic forces, somehow assemble, self-organize, or heal as it begins its journey back into the cold of deep space? We are not tracking a ghost. We are waiting for a survivor to return from an unseen place. We call it 3I divided by Atlas. And to understand its extraordinary resilience, to grasp the full scale of the three questions we now face, we must first decode its name. The Atlas part is simply the designation of the automated survey system that discovered it, a tireless robotic eye scanning the night sky for moving points of light. But the real key, the piece that defines our entire story, is a humble, single letter nestled among the numbers, the letter I. That I is one of the most profound designations in modern astronomy. It stands for Interstellar. This means 3 divided by Atlas is not a member of our family. Almost every comet that lights up our skies, from the famous Halley to the great Hale-Bopp, is ours. They may come from the impossibly distant reaches of the Kuiper belt beyond Neptune's orbit, or from the mythical Oort cloud, a vast, icy cocoon enveloping our entire solar system. But no matter how far they roam, they are still bound by the faint, unshakable gravitational tether of our Sunday. They are prodigal children, wandering members of a vast family, and they always return, or at least they still belong here. 3I divided by Atlas is different. Its orbit is not an ellipse, not a closed loop. Its orbit is a hyperbola, a sharp, clean slice, a one-way trip straight through our system. It came from outside. It is not orbiting our sun. It is merely visiting, and it will never return. Take a moment to contemplate what this truly means. This object has wandered in the cold, absolute darkness between the stars, perhaps for millions, even billions of years. It was born in the primordial dust cloud of another star entirely, a foreign sun, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of light years away. It is an exile, or a messenger, thrown out of its home system by some chaotic gravitational nudge millennia ago. It is not just a comet, it is an alien artifact in the most literal sense. It carries within it the chemical composition, the physical structure, and the primordial memory of a star system we will likely never see. Everything about it is an unknown. It was forged by the physical conditions of another world, a distant cosmic smithy, and it is this interstellar challenger, this uninvited guest from another system, that just dared to fly straight through our furnace and survive. The very fact that it is an interstellar traveler makes its journey not just an astronomical event, it makes it an experiment our solar system is unwittingly conducting on an object forged in an unknown crucible. To understand just how resilient 3I divided by Atlas is, we must pause and contemplate the normal state of cometary death. We must appreciate the furnace it has just flown through. For most comets born within our own system, they are fragile things. We call them dirty snowballs, but perhaps a more poetic image is icy memories of the solar system's dawn. They are loosely bound, porous aggregates of cosmic dust, small rocks, and primordial ices, not just water ice, but frozen carbon dioxide, methane, and ammonia. They have spent the vast majority of their billion-year existence in the near absolute darkness and cold of the Oort cloud, in a state of eternal hibernation. But occasionally, a gentle gravitational nudge from a passing star, or some distant perturbation, sends one on a new path, a long, slow journey toward the inner light. When one of our comets begins that journey, the sun is at first just a distant pinprick, a promise of warmth. But as it crosses the orbit of Jupiter, then Mars, the sun transforms. It ceases to be a point of light. It becomes a fiery eye, then a roaring ocean of plasma. And here, the battle for survival begins. A mortal dance dictated by 3 relentless forces. The first, most obvious, is the heat. This is not the gentle warmth we feel on Earth. This is a relentless photon storm, an intense radiation pressure that strips material from the comet's surface. The ices, frozen for eons, do not melt. They sublimate. They turn directly from solid to gas in micro-explosions, creating the ethereal cloud we call the coma, and the solar wind blows this cloud back, forming the millions of miles long tail. But this process, while beautiful, is a violent erosion. It is like holding a piece of ancient parchment too close to a flame. The second, and perhaps more insidious force is gravity, or more precisely, tidal force. The Sun is monstrously large. As the comet swings close, the Sun's gravity does not pull on the entire object equally. It pulls harder on the side facing it, and slightly less on the side facing away. This tiny differential, magnified by the Sun's enormous mass, becomes a devastating embrace. It stretches the comet, actively trying to tear it asunder. For a loosely bound aggregate, this stretching force is often a death sentence. And the third force, an irony of physics, is self-destruction. As the ices sublimate, they do not vent evenly. They burst forth from fissures or weak spots on the surface, acting like thousands of tiny, chaotic rocket engines firing in all directions. These jets don't just push material away, they begin to spin the nucleus. And as it spins, the centrifugal force adds to the tidal force, aiding in the disintegration. The heat cracks it, gravity stretches it, and its own outgassing spins it to death. This is the normal fate. We have seen it time and time again. Promising comets, like Ison, turned to dust as they grazed the Sunday. Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 was ripped into a string of pearls by Jupiter before it even had a chance, plunging into the giant's atmosphere. This is what we expect, a glorious death. But not 3I divided by Atlas. It, an alien, flew into the heart of this storm. It endured the radiation blast. It withstood the tearing embrace of the tidal forces, and it vented its own substance, and it survived. It emerged on the other side of perihelion, damaged, certainly, but intact. That simple fact, the event of it still being an object and not a cloud, is a staggering piece of data. It implies something profound about its nature. Is it made differently? Is its nucleus denser, more solid, more rock than snow? Was it forged in a star system with more violent conditions, where only the toughest objects could survive? We do not know. But its resilience is the first clue, the foundation for all the mysteries that follow. It has passed through the fire, and immediately after that trial, it drifted into the silence. It has drifted into the silence, and our human minds, programmed to seek peace, tend to equate this silence with relief. We are inclined to think that the solar conjunction we spoke of at the beginning, that blinding spot, is merely a problem of visibility, a curtain. We might easily conclude that 3I divided by Atlas has won its most difficult battle, that it has passed through the perihelion furnace and is now safe, recovering on the other side. We picture it as an exhausted warrior, safe within the fortress walls, hidden from the fight. This is a profound and poetic misunderstanding. The silence 3I divided by Atlas is experiencing is not peace. This obscurity is not a sanctuary. The furnace it just flew through was an acute thermal shock, a moment of intense, high-velocity torture. But the solar conjunction it is drifting within right now is a state of chronic environmental torture. It has escaped the direct lick of the flames, only to fall into an invisible ocean of radiation and plasma. The darkness it is in, where we ask, what is it doing, is not dark at all. It is flooded with an invisible but deeply violent light. First, there is the solar wind. The term sounds gentle, but it is one of the most dynamic forces in our system. Imagine it not as a breeze, but as an eternal plasma hurricane, a relentless stream of charged particles, mostly protons and electrons flung from the sun into space at supersonic speeds, often exceeding 1.5 million kilometers per hour. At this very second, while we cannot see, that plasma storm is lashing 3I divided by Atlas. It is like a sandblaster at the atomic level. It doesn't just push, it erodes. It strips atoms, one by one, from the comet's already heated and weakened surface. Any loose ice molecules remaining after the thermal shock are being sputtered off the surface, knocked loose by the incoming solar wind particles. It also carries energy, continuing to heat the nucleus in a different, quieter, and deeper way. And because 3I divided by Atlas is an interstellar visitor, we have no idea if it possesses a weak magnetic field of its own. If it does, it is struggling within this magnetic tempest, creating complex interactions we cannot even begin to model. Next, there is an even more fundamental force, one we often ignore, the pressure of light itself. Photons, the very particles of light, have no rest mass, but they carry momentum. Every time a photon strikes an object, it imparts a tiny, tiny push. A single photon is negligible. But in the conjunction, 3I divided by Atlas is enduring a relentless storm of photons, quadrillions upon quadrillions, striking it every second. For a massive planet like Earth, this push is almost non-existent. But for a comet, a relatively low-mass object, weary from its journey, and most importantly, likely still venting a faint cloud of dust and gas around it, this push becomes incredibly significant. That cloud of dust and gas acts like a giant ethereal sail, and the sun's radiation pressure is the eternal wind blowing into that sail. This is a non-gravitational force actively at work. It is definitively altering the orbit of 3I divided by Atlas, even as we speak. It is pushing the object, causing it to drift from the purely mathematical path that gravity alone has dictated. This is one of the key reasons why the answer to our second question, is its orbit changing, becomes so incredibly complex. And finally, of course, there is gravity. 3I divided by Atlas is still very, very close to the Sunday. The tidal force, that tearing embrace we described, which tried to pull it to pieces at perihelion, is still immensely powerful. Imagine 3I divided by Atlas as a building that has just survived a massive earthquake. It is still standing, but its internal structure is compromised. Microfractures have formed deep within its nucleus. It is structurally fatigued. And now it is enduring constant aftershocks. The tidal force relentlessly pulls and stretches it, nagging at those newly formed weak points. It is entirely possible that right now, in the unseen silence, gravity is quietly finishing the job that the heat began. It may be widening those small cracks, preparing for a quiet, unseen fragmentation. The solar conjunction is not a waiting room. It is a purgatory in the most literal sense. A place of purification, forced transformation, and relentless trial. 3I divided by Atlas is not just hidden, it is being acted upon. It is being bombarded by solar wind, pushed by light, and stretched by gravity. This is the true context for our three questions. Whatever emerges on the other side, it will not be the same thing that went in. And we did get a glimpse. Between the terrifying moment it grazed perihelion and the fateful moment it drifted into the solar conjunction, there was a brief window, a few precious days, when 3I divided by Atlas's orbit carried it just out of the sun's most blinding corona, but not yet far enough to be eclipsed by the sun itself from Earth's point of view. In those few days, every major telescope on the planet and our robotic eyes in space swiveled to lock onto it. There was a collective silence, a held breath in the astronomical community as we processed the first photons to return. The first, simplest question, was it still there? The answer was yes. 3I divided by Atlas had not disintegrated. The relief was almost palpable, a wave rippling through the scientific networks. It had made it. It had survived. But immediately following that first wave of relief came a second, far more complex realization. It was a qualified survival. The final data we collected was not the image of a triumphant, pristine warrior. No, it was the image of a survivor, wounded, staggering out of the storm's eye, scarred but still standing. This data, this final picture, is the launch point for all our mysteries. First, there was its brightness. It was not a steady, brilliant glow. Instead, the initial reports showed a flickering, a sputtering. Its brightness rose and fell erratically, unpredictably, over periods of hours. This is not the behavior of a solid, stable cometary nucleus cooling gracefully. This is the behavior of something structurally compromised. It was like the flame of a candle in a gale-force wind, not the steady beam of a lighthouse. This flickering is a physical signature. It tells us that the surface of 3I divided by Atlas, its crust, had been fractured by the thermal shock. Like a giant ice floe plunged into a forge, its surface had shattered, exposing pockets of pristine volatile ice beneath. These pockets, upon contact with the intense residual heat, erupted in chaotic, uncontrolled bursts of gas and dust. These explosions, these sputtering gasps, were what caused the violent changes in brightness. It was bleeding material into space. Next, there was the shape of its coma, the head of the comet. Before perihelion, it was relatively symmetric, a fuzzy, near-spherical halo. But in this last data, that halo was distorted. It was elongated, strangely bloated on one side. The sun's immense tidal force, that tearing embrace, had clearly left its mark. This distortion was powerful, indirect evidence that the hidden nucleus within had also been stressed to its absolute limit. It may not have broken into multiple pieces, but it had been warped. And perhaps, most critically for our second question, was what we observed in its tail. It was no longer a single, clean plume. High-resolution observations revealed complex structures, stripes, almost like faint, subordinate tails splitting off from the main flow. What does this imply? It implies that it wasn't just gas being vented. Solid chunks of material, pieces ranging from dust grains to small rocks, were being blasted off the fractured nucleus. Each of these fragments began its own orbit, pushed by the sun's radiation pressure at a slightly different rate, creating a complex ribbon-like torn pattern. And it was these chaotic jets of gas and ejected debris that provided the undeniable proof. They were the tiny, uneven rocket engines we spoke of. We had visual confirmation that 3I divided by Atlas was no longer a passive object obeying only gravity. It was actively, chaotically, propelling itself in unpredictable directions. Its orbit was already beginning to change, right before our very eyes. And then, it was gone, like a heavily damaged ship, still sparking and venting smoke, sending one last distorted transmission, before it slipped over the far side of the world, into a sea where we could not follow. Our last data point is not a clean snapshot. It is a single frozen image of an ongoing crisis. A wounded object, violently active, bleeding matter, and pushing itself into the darkness. This is our starting point. This is the initial condition we must feed into our models, a state not of stability, but of intense, dynamic change. And so, it vanished. The interstellar challenger, wounded, still leaking matter, and chaotically propelling itself, drifted into the great blind spot. On Earth, we were left behind. Left with what? Not with an object to observe, but with a set of numbers. Cold, hard numbers. Its last known coordinates, its last velocity vector, and the last spectroscopic data on its chaotic outgassing. In the enforced silence of the conjunction, these numbers are all we have. But in the hands of science, these numbers, when combined with the fundamental laws of physics, become a powerful tool of prophecy. We call it the orbital model. This is the bridge we build with mathematics, an attempt of reason to span the abyss of the unseeable. And this is how we build it, layer by layer. The first layer, the foundation of the entire structure, is one of pure elegance. It is Newton's law of universal gravitation, refined by Einstein's general relativity. This layer assumes 3I divided by Atlas is a completely passive object. It treats the comet as a simple stone, an inert cosmic marble, with no will or agency of its own. In this idealized model, its path is dictated solely by a two-body dance, its own mass, and the monstrous mass of the Sunday. We feed in its last known data, and the equations draw a perfect, predictable, graceful curve, a hyperbola. This curve, beautiful and orderly, tells us exactly, to the second, where 3I divided by Atlas should reappear on the other side of the Sunday. This is our benchmark. In science, we call this the null hypothesis. It is a baseline of simplicity, a statement of a clean clockwork universe. It is the answer to the question, what would happen if the comet did nothing but obey gravity? This is the blueprint of normality. But we, who saw the final data in part 3.1, know better. We know this hypothesis is almost certainly wrong. We saw that it was not a passive stone. We saw it was an active body. We saw it bleeding matter, flickering with uncontrolled gas explosions. We saw its torn tail, the evidence of ejected fragments. And every single one of those jets of gas, every piece of debris thrown clear, acts as a micro-rocket engine. They create what astronomers call non-gravitational forces. These are tiny, chaotic thrusts, unrelated to gravity, but profoundly capable of altering the trajectory of a relatively low-mass object, like a comet. The difference is like predicting the path of a cannonball versus predicting the path of an exploding firework. The cannonball follows a beautiful parabola, subject only to gravity and air resistance. But the firework? It propels itself, it bursts, it changes direction erratically. 3I divided by Atlas, in our last moments of observation, was behaving like a firework. So, the scientists must build the second layer of the model, a far more complex one. We take that pure gravitational model and we try to correct it. We try to account for those non-gravitational forces. We measure the amount of outgassing we saw in the final data. We estimate its direction and strength, and we add these pushes to our equations. We are essentially saying, let us assume the comet continues to behave chaotically, in the exact same way it was behaving when we last saw it. This corrected model produces a second predicted orbit. It is no longer as elegant. It is a compromise, a grittier prediction, one that accounts for the comet's wounded state. And this second model predicts that 3I divided by Atlas will reappear in a slightly different place than the pure model, and perhaps at a slightly different time. But it is right here that we hit the wall of uncertainty, the purgatory of the conjunction. Our second, more realistic model rests on one critical, fragile assumption. It assumes the comet's chaotic activity is consistent. But why would we believe that? 3I divided by Atlas is not a machine. It is a natural body in crisis. Right now, in that unseen darkness, it is cooling. As it cools, some of those gas-venting fissures may be sealing themselves shut. Or, perhaps because its structure is compromised, new fissures are opening up in entirely different places. Perhaps it has quietly fractured into 2 or 3 large pieces, and each piece is now on its own path, pushed by its own non-gravitational forces. The data we are using to correct our model is already stale. We are trying to predict the path of a hurricane using only a photograph from weeks ago. We have no idea what is happening to its rocket engines right now. What is the result? The result is that our orbital model is not truly a sharp line in the sky. It is not a single destination. Instead, it is a cone of uncertainty. Imagine it as an ink blot spreading out over time. It starts as a precise point, our last known location, and as it travels through the conjunction, the area where we can predict it will emerge, spreads out into a search zone. The pure gravity model, the null hypothesis, lies somewhere near the center of this smudge. Our corrected model, our best guess, lies in a slightly different spot within it. But the truth? The truth could be anywhere in that region. This smudge, this cone of uncertainty, is our true benchmark. It is the visual representation of the limits of human knowledge. It is a map, not just of the comet's path, but of the boundaries of our own ignorance. And now, we wait. We aim our telescopes not at a single point, but at that entire region. When 3I divided by Atlas does emerge, the first question will be, where is it? Is it precisely on the pure gravity line, which would mean miraculously all its activity stopped the instant it disappeared? Is it near our corrected model, which would mean our assumptions about consistent chaos were correct? Or, and this is the most thrilling possibility, will it appear somewhere unexpected, on the far edge of the cone, or perhaps even outside of it? Such an appearance would be a message, a new piece of data telling us that something profound, something we failed to model, happened in the dark. The orbital model is not just a prediction, it is the question we are formally asking the universe. And the universe in its own time is preparing its reply. And so, here we are. At this very moment in our journey, we have built our mathematical bridge, that fragile cone of uncertainty stretching across the abyss of the conjunction. We have aimed our greatest eyes, our vast radio telescopes, giant dishes listening for the echoes of the cosmos toward the patch of sky where 3I divided by Atlas is predicted to re-emerge. And what we have received for all these long weeks is an absolute, profound silence. A deep, unbroken quiet, pierced only by the eternal static roar of our own parent star. We have no new data, not a single stray photon, not one faint radio signal has pushed through the plasma curtain, nothing. In a world obsessed with instantaneous information, with a never-ending stream of data, we have hit a blank white wall of absence. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the final and perhaps most crucial piece of evidence in our presentation, the absence of evidence itself. We call it the eloquent silence. Eloquent because this silence is not an emptiness. It is not a technological failure or a boring pause in the narrative, no. This silence is an event. It is an active presence. It is like the calculated rest between notes in a symphony, a pause that holds all the tension and meaning. It is like the stillness inside a chrysalis, a quiet that is not death, but the necessary hush of a deep, unimaginable transformation. This silence is the very heart of the mystery. It is an ongoing physical state. Every second that ticks by in which we receive no signal is not a wasted second. It is a second in which the unseen physical processes continue their work. The purgatory of the conjunction, as we have described it, is not a waiting room. It is a laboratory in session, and the sun has locked the door, refusing to let us look inside. This silence, more than any data we've collected, strips us of our hubris. It places us, for a moment, with all our advanced satellites and supercomputers, right back alongside the ancient Babylonian astronomers. We are left with only our mathematical models and our patience. We can predict, but we cannot know. The sun's wall of fire has imposed a mandatory humility upon our boundless human curiosity. And it is this eloquent silence that makes our three questions not just interesting speculations, but philosophical necessities. This silence is the air those three questions breathe. Consider our first question. What is it doing in that darkness? The silence is the answer, for now. The silence is the sound of its surface chemistry changing. It is the sound of the solar wind eroding its nucleus at an atomic level. It is the sound of microfractures quietly spreading, or perhaps of volatiles refreezing as it slowly moves farther away. The absence of data is the very proof that a private, unseen process is underway, one that requires no observer. And our second question, is its orbit changing? Again, this silence is the very space in which that change is accumulating. Every unobserved second is a second that its chaotic, microscopic rocket engines, the jets of gas and dust we saw before it vanished, continue to push it, little by little, off its pure mathematical path. It is like an unmanned ship in a dense fog, slowly drifting from its expected course. We know it is drifting. This silence is the time it is allowed to drift undetected. We cannot measure that drift in real time, and so our uncertainty grows with every beat of the clock. And finally, our strangest question, is it reassembling? This silence is the prerequisite. Such a reassembly, such a subtle self-organization of debris or dust around the main nucleus, would not be a loud event. It would not be an explosion. It would be a quiet gravitational ballet, a reordering of chaos, possible only in the absolute undisturbed dark. If 3I divided by Atlas is healing itself, if it is gathering its lost flock of material back into a more stable system, it requires this very thing, privacy. The eloquent silence of the conjunction is not a barrier to this process. It may be the very crucible required for it. So, we have come to the end of what we know. We have presented the last data, we have built the predictive models, and now we have presented the final evidence, the eloquent absence of any new evidence at all. We are standing at the absolute boundary between known reality and disciplined imagination. This silence is not a stop sign. It is an invitation. It is a vacuum that nature abhors, and that the human imagination, disciplined by the laws of physics, must rush in to fill. The absence of data is not the end of science. It is the very place where science truly begins. It forces us to move from being passive recorders to active theorists. It forces us to ask, what if? And that is the bridge to the next part of our journey. We have run out of facts. It is time, now, to explore the ideas. We have run out of data. We have stood at the edge of that misty cone of uncertainty and listened. And all we have heard is the eloquent silence of the cosmos. Now, we have no choice but to do what the human mind does best. We must step into that void. We must light the candle of reason and disciplined imagination and explore the darkness for ourselves. We begin with the most fundamental and profound question, the first of our Trinity. At this very moment, completely hidden from view, What is 3I divided by Atlas doing? What transformation is it undergoing in its private purgatory? The first hypothesis, the one science must always consider first, is the hypothesis of simplicity. We call it passive recovery. In this scenario, the most dramatic event is already over. The explosion, the chaos, the sputtering, flickering data we saw in part 3.1, that was the climax. That was the comet's final scream as it was plunged into the fire. Imagine 3I divided by Atlas as a bar of metal, thrust by a cosmic blacksmith into the perihelion forge. It was heated white hot to the very edge of melting. Our last data captured the moment it was pulled free, still glowing, still throwing off sparks, the gas jets and fragments, and hissing with thermal agony. And then it was tossed into the conjunction, a dark, cold, near-perfect vacuum of a room. Passive recovery is simply the process of that metal bar cooling down. In that unseen silence, the only sound is the invisible hiss of infrared radiation. 3I divided by Atlas is shedding its fever, not into air, but into empty space itself. Photon by photon of heat is leaving its surface, carrying entropy, carrying the chaotic energy away forever. And as the surface cools, a physical change takes place. All those volatile ice pockets, the methanes, the carbon dioxides that caused the chaotic bursts we observed, are now depleted. The fire has burned up the most flammable tinder. The fissures and cracks on the surface, the wounds that were venting material, are now scabbing over. They are no longer active volcanoes. They are becoming cold scars. The violent flickering we saw has died down, like a fire starved of its fuel. In this scenario, 3 divided by Atlas is dying down. It is transitioning from an active, chaotic firework, as we last saw it, back into a passive stone. It is becoming inert. The silence we are currently witnessing in this case is the sound of cessation, the sound of the storm having passed. If this hypothesis is true, it has profound implications for our other two questions. It means the microscopic rocket engines have shut off. Therefore, its orbit, question 2, will stop being affected by non-gravitational forces. It will stabilize, and its path will revert to obeying the pure, orderly gravitational curve we calculated in our first model. And it almost certainly means no reassembly. Question 3. Things cannot self-organize without energy. It is a simple, elegant, and perhaps slightly sad ending. It means 3I divided by Atlas is simply returning to its state as a cold, damaged, and now permanently silent interstellar traveler, continuing its lonely journey out of our system. But what if that silence is not a cessation? What if it is not the sound of a death, but the focus required for a rebirth? This brings us to our second hypothesis, a more complex, profound, and physically beautiful scenario. Surface metamorphosis. Let us return to our analogy, but this time, not a forge, brightest, 3I divided by Atlas, is not a bar of metal, which cools, but remains metal. No. Imagine 3I divided by Atlas as a block of raw, wet, primordial clay, containing all the materials of its home star system. The perihelion furnace did not just heat it, it fired it. And when you fire clay, it does not cool down into hot clay. It cools down into something entirely new. It becomes ceramic. This is an irreversible chemical transformation. This hypothesis suggests that the extreme heat did not just vaporize the surface ices. It did more. It melted the silicate minerals, the very rock, on the comet's surface. It created a thin, boiling layer of magma all over the nucleus. And now, in the darkness of the conjunction, that magma is cooling. But it is not cooling back into the original porous dust and rock. It is cooling into a hard, solid, glassy crust, a process called vitrification. 3 divided by Atlas in the dark is shedding its skin. It is forging itself a new suit of armor. This ceramic shell, perhaps only centimeters or a few meters thick, would change everything about it. This crust acts like a giant, structural lid forged from the comet's own substance. It is sealing, trapping, everything left beneath it. It is trapping the residual heat from perihelion, keeping it in the core. And more importantly, it is trapping all the pristine ices, especially water ice, that did not have time to vaporize deep inside the nucleus. In this scenario, 3I divided by Atlas is undergoing an internal division. On the outside, it will soon become a dead object. This new glassy crust is incredibly stable. It doesn't vent gas, it doesn't react. When 3I divided by Atlas emerges, it may look incredibly faint and dark, almost like an inert asteroid rather than a living comet. Its surface will no longer be bleeding. But inside that self-made armor, a completely different story is unfolding. Inside, it is a ticking time bomb. Its core is still hot, and the trapped water ice is under immense pressure. This metamorphosis means the comet is not recovering, it is transforming. It is containing its crisis rather than releasing it. This hypothesis beautifully explains the resilience of 3I divided by Atlas. How could an interstellar visitor survive a sun graze? Perhaps this was not its first time. Perhaps, in its chaotic home system, it has grazed its own star before, and it already had such a ceramic crust, and our sun-grazing event simply added another layer of glaze to that ancient vessel. So, what is it doing in the darkness? Is it passively recovering like a dying ember? Or is it undergoing metamorphosis like clay in a kiln? Is it returning to inertia, or is it turning itself into a silent fortress, hiding a stormy heart? Both processes are occurring in absolute silence. And the answer to this first question, which we will know soon when it emerges, will be the key to unlocking the other two mysteries. We are not just waiting to see where it is. We are waiting to see what it has become. And so, we have contemplated its internal transformation, the possibility that it is cooling or that it is forging itself a ceramic crust. Both of those scenarios lead us directly to our second question, a question of action and consequence. Is its orbit changing? This question touches upon one of the most beautiful and unsettling concepts in astrophysics, the fragility of destiny. We tend to think of cosmic orbits as steel railroad tracks, preordained by gravity, eternal and immutable. An object with the mass of billions of tons, traveling at tens of kilometers per second, seems like it should have an unshakable path. But the truth, especially for a comet, is far more delicate. Its fate is not written in stone, it is written on water. And the short answer to, is its orbit changing, is almost certainly yes. It already has. Our last data in part 3.1 showed us that unequivocally. We saw it venting, we saw its torn tail, we saw the rocket effect in action. The real question is not if it changed, but is it still changing in the darkness? And how is it changing? Here, we again come to a fork in the road, defined by two hypotheses. The first, which is almost a certainty, is the subtle rocket effect. This hypothesis follows a beautiful logic. It concedes that, most likely, the passive recovery or surface metamorphosis scenarios from 4.1 are correct. Both imply that the violent, chaotic outgassing the explosions we saw have probably stopped. The crust may have sealed them, or the most volatile fuel has been spent. If that is true, one might conclude that the non-gravitational forces have shut off, that the comet has reverted to a passive stone, and its orbit is now locked in, stable, obeying that pure gravitational curve. But this ignores a second, much more subtle force. The nucleus of 3I divided by Atlas did not cool instantly. It is a massive chunk of ice and rock, and the intense heat from perihelion will take weeks or months to fully escape its core. And it is still rotating. Imagine this slowly, unevenly spinning object, still warm from the inside. Whenever a surface area that contains water ice, not the more volatile ices that are already gone, rotates to face the sun's light, even the faint, ambient light in the conjunction it still sublimates, gently. It is no longer a chaotic explosion. It is more like a steady, slow breath, a weak, constant stream of gas, persistently evaporating from the day side of the rotating nucleus. And this steady stream, however faint, acts as a thruster, an incredibly tiny but constant thruster. This is no longer the chaos of a firework. This is the subtle persistence of an ion engine. And because it is constantly pushing in one direction, away from the sun, and because it is doing so for weeks and months in silence, it is accumulating. Little by little, second by second, it is nudging 3I divided by Atlas off the path that gravity decreed. It is like a massive ocean liner whose course across the ocean is being altered, not by a storm, but by the collective breath of its thousands of passengers, all breathing in one direction. The change is infinitesimal, but it is not zero. This is the fragility of destiny. A path set in motion millions of years ago by a nudge from an unknown star is now being rewritten, millimeter by millimeter, by its own sublimating breath. If this hypothesis is true, it means that when 3I divided by Atlas emerges, it will not be where the pure gravity model predicts, but it will also not be where our chaotic model from 3.2 predicts. It will be in a third place, one that can only be explained by a gentle, constant, persistent push that we could not see. It will be proof that change does not have to be loud. It can be a quiet, persistent drift. But there is another possibility, a bolder, more dramatic hypothesis. It suggests the change in orbit is not just a nudge, it is a schism. We call it invisible fragmentation. This hypothesis looks back at our last data. We saw an object that was distorted. We saw evidence of structural cracks. We knew it was compromised. And we know from part 2.3 that even in the conjunction, it is still suffering aftershocks. The sun's relentless tidal force is still pulling and stretching it. The passive recovery and metamorphosis hypotheses from 4.1 both assumed the nucleus held. They assumed the building, though cracked, remained standing. But invisible fragmentation asks the terrifying question, what if it didn't? What if, one day after it vanished from our sight, one of those structural cracks finally gave way? What if, in the absolute silence, with no one to witness, the nucleus of 3I divided by Atlas, simply broke in two? It would not be an explosion. There would be no flash of light. It would be a quiet separation, a crack that became a gap, one object that became two or three or a ghostly string of pearls, just as the legendary comet Shoemaker, Levy 9, did before it struck Jupiter. If this has happened, then all our orbital models are useless. We are no longer tracking one entity. We are tracking a broken family. And this is where the physics of orbital change becomes dramatic. Each of these new fragments let us imagine two. A large core piece and a smaller one begins a new life. They have different masses. They have different surface areas. They have different rotation rates. And therefore, all the non-gravitational forces we've discussed, the sun's radiation pressure, the solar wind, and their own subtle rocket effects, will act on them differently. The sunlight, radiation pressure, will push the smaller, lighter fragment harder and faster, like wind pushing a leaf more than a stone. The larger, denser core piece will be less affected. Immediately, their orbits begin to diverge. They will still travel in the same general direction, but they will no longer be one. They will be slowly, silently drifting apart, like survivors on different pieces of a shipwreck. If this hypothesis is true, it explains the orbital change in the most profound way possible. It means the orbit didn't just change, it multiplied. When we aim our telescopes at that cone of uncertainty, we may not find a single point of light. We may, instead, see something strange. An object that looks blurry, smudged, impossible to focus because it is in fact two objects too close for our telescopes to resolve. Or, if we are lucky and they have drifted far enough, we may see two or three faint pinpricks of light where there should only be one. It is a haunting possibility. That 3I divided by Atlas survived the furnace, only to quietly break apart in the darkness that followed. And this possibility, this fragmentation, is the necessary bridge, the absolute prerequisite for us to dare to explore our final and strangest. And so, we arrive at the final rung of our hypothesis ladder. We have climbed from the possibility of a quiet, cooling silence to a chemical metamorphosis, to a subtle orbital drift, and finally, to the potential for a quiet fragmentation in the dark. And it is this very invisible fragmentation hypothesis, this idea that 3I divided by Atlas may now be two or three or many drifting pieces, that unlocks the door to our last and strangest question. A question that sounds almost like science fiction, yet is rooted deeply in the physics of chaos and order. Can it reassemble? We must be exceptionally careful with this word, because our human imagination, fed by stories, immediately leaps to a specific image: reassembly. We picture the shattered pieces of a starship by some magical force, reversing course, flying back together, and sticking into a hole. Let us begin by extinguishing that image with the cold water of physics. This is hypothesis A, mechanical reassembly, and it is almost certainly impossible. The reasons are simple. First, gravity. The mutual gravity of those fragments, let us imagine two giant boulders of ice and dust, is incredibly, vanishingly weak. They do not have enough mass to pull each other back together with any real force. Second, and more importantly, is the sun's tidal force. That tearing embrace, the one that caused the fragmentation in the first place, is still there. It doesn't just prevent them from getting close, it is still actively pulling them apart. And third, there is momentum. When the two pieces broke apart, they were given their own momentum, carrying them on slightly different orbits, as we established in hypothesis 4.2. There is no braking force in the universe, no cosmic glue, that can overcome these three fundamental forces to physically stick them back together. They will not heal. The fragmentation, if it happened, is irreversible. So why then do we even ask the question? We ask because perhaps we are misunderstanding the very word reassemble. What if reassembly does not mean fusion, but organization? What if it is not a structural healing, but the birth of a new system? This brings us to hypothesis B, an idea as poetic as it is physically plausible: gravitational reorganization, or the herding of the flock. This hypothesis is entirely dependent on the previous one that the comet broke, but it looks at the result not as an ending but as a beginning. Picture this scenario slowly. During the thermal shock of its perihelion pass, part 3.1, 3I divided by Atlas didn't just crack, it bled material. It ejected a massive cloud of dust, pebbles, and ice fragments. Let us call this the brood cloud. Then, in the darkness of the conjunction, hypothesis 4.2, the main nucleus, already compromised, finally fractured, perhaps into one large core piece and a few smaller ones. Now, we have a chaotic situation. One large core fragment, let's call it the king, a few smaller fragments, the princes, and a vast cloud of dust and debris, the subjects. Conventional physics says they will all drift apart, pushed by the solar wind and radiation pressure, to be scattered forever. But gravitational reorganization proposes another possibility. The main core piece, the king, though diminished, is still the most massive object in the group. It still has its own gravitational sphere of influence, a tiny, weak bubble of space where its pull is stronger than the tidal pull of the Sunday. And what if the majority of that brood cloud, the dust and pebbles ejected, did not have enough speed, not enough energy, to escape that weak bubble of influence? What if the princes, the smaller fragments, were similarly captured? They would not fly back and stick to the king. No, they would do something far more beautiful. They would begin to orbit it. The chaos of the explosion and the fragmentation, rather than creating dispersal, would have accidentally created a new order. It would have created a mini-system. Reassembly, in this context, means that 3I divided by Atlas has herded its own destruction. It has tamed its cloud of debris. It has turned its own fragments from escapees into satellites. If this hypothesis is true, it means that what emerges from the conjunction will be the most wondrous thing we can imagine. It will not be one point of light. It will not be 2 or 3 points of light. It will be a ghostly flock. We will aim our telescopes at it and see an object that looks strangely fuzzy, fluffy, not because it is venting gas, but because it is literally a central nucleus surrounded by a tiny, orbiting cloud of its own satellites, dust and debris, all flying in formation, locked in a silent gravitational dance. This would be a comet that is broken, but not disintegrated. It would have transformed from a single entity into a collective. It would have self-organized. This is a profoundly deep idea. It suggests that the universe, even in its most violent and destructive acts, has an innate tendency toward structure, toward complexity. It suggests that from the chaos of a near-death experience, a new, more intricate order can be born. And it would mean that 3I, divided by Atlas, our interstellar visitor, survived not by returning to what it was, but by becoming something entirely new. A ghostly comet system, a tiny family born of fire and darkness. continuing its journey out into the void. We have climbed to the very top of our hypothesis ladder, and this is the vista we see. An object cooling, an object metamorphosing, an object drifting, and finally, an object perhaps rebirthing itself as a flock. 3 questions, 3 possibilities, all unfolding right now in that unseen silence. And now, there is only one thing left to do. And so, we have stood at the apex of our ladder of hypothesis, staring down into the abyss of that unseen silence. We have considered the possibilities: a cold death, a ceramic metamorphosis, an inevitable orbital drift, or even a rebirth as a ghostly flock. But regardless of which of these precise forms 3, I, divided by Atlas, re-emerges in, whether it is 1 or 2 or a collective, one fundamental truth continues to glow through all possibilities. A truth that was established the moment we recognized its trajectory. It is a visitor. It is an outsider. And it survived. This is not just a story about a single comet. This is a lesson, perhaps the most profound lesson 3 I divided by Atlas has to offer, whatever its final fate in the darkness. This is a message in a bottle, thrown into the cosmic ocean from a shore we do not know, which has somehow washed up onto our own. And that message, written in the language of physics and endurance, seems to be saying, our systems are not like yours. We are accustomed to our comets. The objects born of our Oort cloud or Kuiper belt are fragile entities, porous, loosely bound snowballs that have spent billions of years in a cold hibernation. We have seen how easily they break, how readily they disintegrate when they approach the Sunday. Our models of cometary destruction are built upon these delicate children. But 3I divided by Atlas came from somewhere else. The simple fact that it could withstand the thermal shock and the tidal forces that should have ripped it to dust implies something deep about its birthplace. Was it forged in a much more chaotic star system? A place of migrating gas giants, flinging objects out into the void with terrifying velocity? Was it born in a dense star cluster, where the intense radiation from neighboring stars baked and hardened its surface millennia ago, granting it the very ceramic armor we hypothesized? We cannot know for sure, but it is a sample. It is a physical piece of another world, and it is tougher than we thought. It forces us to look back at the comfort of our own solar system. Is it possible that our relatively peaceful existence, with its stable, orderly orbits, is not the rule? Is it perhaps the exception? 3I, divided by Atlas, in its silence, has become a mirror, reflecting our own ignorance of the greater galaxy. It suggests we may be living in a quiet oasis, and that out there, in the vast ocean between the stars, is a tougher, more resilient, and far stranger place than we have ever dared to imagine. That lesson in resilience is, in itself, a discovery. But there is perhaps a more philosophical truth, one woven not from the object itself, but from its concealment. Our entire journey tonight has centered around a conjunction, a blind spot. We are obsessed with what we cannot see. We build complex models, we climb ladders of hypothesis, all in an attempt to pierce a veil. And that veil, that unseen purgatory of the sun, teaches us a second, more humbling lesson. It reminds us that the universe does not operate for our benefit. It does not perform. It does not care if we are watching. At this very second, as we sit here contemplating, the most important events in the life of 3I, divided by Atlas, may be unfolding. It may be quietly fracturing in two. It may be sealing its final ceramic crust. It may be herding its own cloud of satellites. A new creation or a final destruction is taking place in absolute silence, with no human eye to witness it. We have an unconscious tendency to believe in a kind of if a tree falls in the forest physics, that if we cannot measure something, it isn't truly real. The solar conjunction is the universe's answer to that. It says emphatically, it is real. Existence does not require an observer. Transformation does not ask for our permission. The cosmos continues to turn, to change, to create, and to destroy in our great blind spots, with complete and majestic indifference. The journey of 3I divided by Atlas in the shadow of the sun is a powerful reminder that we are not the audience for whom the universe performs. We are merely the lucky ones who happen to catch a few scenes of a grand, infinite play, most of whose acts take place behind the curtain. And so, after all the complex mathematical models, after all the bold hypotheses, we return to the most ancient, most fundamental, astronomical virtue, patience. Now, we can only wait. We, with all our giant observatories and supercomputers, are no different from the ancient Chaldean shepherds, scanning the pre-dawn horizon, waiting for a sign, a wandering star, to emerge from the darkness. This act of waiting, it is more than science. It touches something elemental in the human condition, because, in our own lives, do we not all know this feeling? The feeling of drifting in our own solar conjunction, a period of uncertainty, a future obscured by some blinding event, when we cannot know what we will become on the other side of a great trial. We enter the shadow as one thing, and we can only trust that we will emerge, transformed. And then, one day, very soon, perhaps even this week, a single photon from 3I divided by Atlas, having traveled millions of miles alone through the purgatory, will pierce the dark and strike one of our mirrors. A signal will appear on a screen. A faint dot of light will be confirmed. When it emerges from that curtain of fire, it will not just be an object, it will be an answer. Its precise location in the sky, measured against that cone of uncertainty we have drawn, will be a final message, written in the cosmic language of gravity and physics. It will tell us what it did in the dark. It will tell us if it merely cooled, if it subtly drifted, or if it shattered. It will tell us if it emerges as a single survivor or as a ghostly flock. And as we look at that interstellar visitor, forever changed by its journey through our furnace, perhaps we are not just looking for a lost comet, we are looking for confirmation. Confirmation that even after the most profound, seemingly total breakage, even in the most absolute, unseen and lonely silence, the journey continues. And that, emerging on the other side, scarred, transformed, is, in itself, always a miracle.